There's a question at the center of the abortion debate that doesn't get asked enough, and it's what exactly makes someone a person? Not just biologically, but morally. What is it that gives a being the kind of value that makes it wrong to kill them? Now, before we get into that, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rafael. I'm the host of the Small Town Bible Questions YouTube channel, where I help answer any of your Bible questions and anything really related to Christianity. Now, if you're new here, I would love it if you would like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and as always, don't forget to hit the bell notification icon. That way you don't miss any of the future videos that I make, and it also helps other people find this kind of content and help them join in the conversation. So now that the YouTube stuff is done, let's get back into today's topic. What makes someone a person? Not just biologically, but morally. Now, different philosophers have given different answers to that question, and we've already seen in the last two videos the answers that you give don't just affect abortion, but it also tends to reshape how you think about human equality itself. In the previous videos, we looked at Michael Tooley and Peter Singer, both of whom argue that moral worth depends on certain developmental abilities like self-consciousness or the ability to form preferences about the future. And in this video, we're going to examine another influential philosopher who takes a similar approach but frames it in a different way. Her name is Mary Ann Warren, and in her 1973 essay on the moral and legal status of abortion, Warren sets out to define what a person actually is. Her goal is to identify which beings count as members of the moral community and therefore have rights. Warren argues that being biologically human is not enough. Instead, personhood depends on the presence of certain psychological traits, capacities that are associated with moral agency, and she identifies 5 in particular: consciousness, reasoning, self-motivated activity, the ability to communicate, and self-awareness. Now, these are not meant to function as a strict checklist, but as indicators. On her view, beings who sufficiently exhibit these traits qualify as persons in the moral sense. And that leads directly to her conclusion. Since fetuses do not display these characteristics, they are not persons. They may be biologically human, but they are not members of the moral community. And if that's right, then abortion does not violate anyone's right because there's no person there to be wrong. But once you start to examine this framework more closely, a number of serious problems begin to emerge. Now, the first problem with Warren's criteria is that it lacks a principle foundation. She gives us a list of traits, but she doesn't give us a non-circular reason as to why these particular traits and not others should determine moral worth. For example, imagine if someone gave you a different list. Instead of reasoning and self-awareness, let's say that they emphasize emotional bonding or the ability to form relationships. On that view, a deeply rational human being might count more than someone who is highly rational but socially awkward. So, or for example, imagine if someone argued that belonging to the human species itself is what grounds moral worth. What makes Warren's list correct and those alternatives wrong? Without a clear standard, the criteria begins to reflect our preferences about which traits we admire rather than identifying something objectively true about who has rights. Now, the second problem in her argument is that she confuses performance with capacity. She focuses on whether a being is currently exercising certain abilities, but we don't normally treat moral status in that way. For example, a person who is asleep or in a temporary coma or under anesthesia is not actively reasoning, communicating, or self-aware in that moment, but we still recognize that they have a right to life, and that's because they retain the underlying capacity for those abilities. Now, if we apply that same reasoning to early human development, a fetus is not currently reasoning or communicating, but it is the kind of being whose natural development includes those capacities. Just as a child is not yet an adult, but it is already the same individual who will become one. The unborn are not yet expressing these traits, but are the same beings who will. And this reveals a deeper problem. If personhood depends on current exercises of these abilities, then personhood would not be stable. It would come and go depending on whether these abilities are active at a given moment. Someone could lose their status as a person while they're unconscious and then regain it back when they wake up. But obviously, our moral and legal intuitions don't work that way. A person does not lose the right to life every time they fall asleep or go under surgery. And again, the reasoning is simple. We recognize that personhood belongs to the kind of being someone is, not merely the abilities that they're exercising at a particular moment. If rights depended on current performances, then they would fluctuate with development, and again, that would make moral status unstable. Now, the third problem is deeper and has to do with what these abilities actually are. Capacities like reasoning, communication don't exist on their own. They're activities performed by a subject, a unified being that persists through time. For example, when you remember something from your childhood, it only makes sense because you are the same individual who had those early experiences. So the question is not just when certain abilities appear, but what kind of being is capable of developing them. The fetus is that kind of being, a conscious self-directing organism whose development is intentionally ordered towards these capacities. The same individual who will later think, communicate, and become self-aware already exists even before those abilities are expressed. So these traits don't create the person, they presuppose one. And once you see that, the implications of Warren's view become much harder to avoid. She acknowledges that her criteria would not classify newborns as full persons and concedes that infanticide could, in principle, be morally permissible, even if she would restrict them in practice. But again, this creates a serious tension in her position. If her criteria are the correct standards of personhood, then the conclusion follows. A newborn does not suddenly gain reasoning or self-awareness simply by passing through the birth canal. So if those traits are what matter, then the moral status of the child should remain the same before and after birth. So for her to try to reject infanticide while keeping the same criteria is an attempt to draw a line that her theory itself does not support. In other words, you can't have your cake and eat it too. And finally, even when we set all that aside, there's a deeper question that still needs to be answered. Why do these traits confer moral worth in the first place? Why should the ability to reason or think or communicate determine whether someone has the right to life? Imagine if you have two people, one that's really smart, has really developed cognitive abilities, and somebody else who has cognitive impairments. Does the first person really have a greater right to life than the second? And if moral value is granted in these kinds of traits, then it becomes a matter of degrees, and equality begins to break down. Because someone who has greater intelligence, reasoning abilities, or self-awareness would possess more of the qualities that supposedly ground personhood, and then therefore more moral worth. But obviously that would undermine the very idea of human equality. Our moral and legal system don't treat the right to life as something that increases with intelligence or cognitive abilities. If they did, then the smartest among us would have the greatest right to life, while the most vulnerable would have the least. And if the answer is simply that we value beings with these traits, then the theory doesn't explain moral worth, it just describes our preferences. It would tell us who we tend to treat as persons, but not who actually is one in the end. Warren's attempt to define personhood in terms of psychological traits runs into the same fundamental problem that we've seen throughout this series. When moral worth is grounded in developmental abilities, it becomes conditional, unequal, and dependent on factors that can change over time. When rights depend on the development or expressions of certain functions, some humans will always fall outside of that boundary of protection. A more consistent foundation is that moral worth belongs to us in virtue of the kinds of being that we are, not because of what we can do at a given moment, but because of what we are by nature. And this is what being made in the image of God offers the most coherent explanation for that foundation. If worth comes from being created in His image, then it isn't something that we develop, earn, or perform. It belongs to us simply because of what we are. That's why every human being, regardless of cognitive ability, age, or stage of development, has equal and unchanging worth. Not because of what we can do, but because who made them. And if that's true, then every human life matters equally from its earliest beginning to its natural end. Now that's all for this video. Again, if you made it to the end, then please like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and make sure that you don't forget to hit that bell notification icon. That way you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. And again, if you haven't watched the previous videos in this series, go to the description. There'll be links there so you can watch them. Till next time, God bless.